Last week, Zoom meeting was the night before my 48th birthday, and my lovely Malaysian and students did a compilation of a lovely 10-minute compilation of grateful and appreciative messages from various students in parts of the world. But JC started the clip with pictures of myself with my mum and dad, and then pictures of myself with my main teachers, Ajahn Sumedho, Ajahn Pasanno, Ajahn Jayasaro, Ajahn Anan, the Dalai Lama. And so in hearing, listening to and seeing people's expression of gratitude, is a very beautiful quality, very touching. Then I naturally thought of my teachers and what I learned from them and how grateful I am to them also. And so in part one last week, talked about how my first teacher in Australia was actually the beach. And I learned a little bit about meditating on the four elements and finding a peaceful space as a little boy on the beach. And then my second teacher was the friendly lady in the crystal shop who taught me white light meditation. And that was the beginning of a samatha practice and very helpful. Then I discovered a book which had a prayer, and I recited that prayer. An important part of that prayer was a request of the forces of light to lead me along the path of love, light, and truth. That became an important motivating factor in my life as a 18-year-old. Then next real first Dharma teacher, Buddhist Dharma teacher, was S.N. Goenkaji from the Vipassana retreat that I did when I was 20 years old. And I had a peaceful experience on the 8th day after sitting with enormous amounts of pain, which reoriented my whole life in a way, because that quality of mental peacefulness that arose due to maintaining consistent mindfulness, when I experienced a gathering and a collecting in my mind, that was something that I'd felt even from childhood that I was looking for. It was like searching for something that I knew was there, that I knew I hadn't found yet. And I knew that my teachers weren't talking about it, and I knew my parents weren't talking about it. But when I experienced on the 8th day of the 10-day meditation retreat a quality of peacefulness, coolness, fullness, contentedness, contentment, then I knew, yes, that's what I've been searching for. And I do think there's been some practice in past lives, because that sense of knowing that this particular thing is out there somewhere was with me from a fairly young age. And of course, the big discovery is that something out there is actually in here is an important lesson, isn't it? A large part about what practice teaches us is that, if I have a good quality of virtue, and if I make efforts at being consistently mindful, then the mind itself will experience contentment, wellness, a sense of well-being. And so thank goodness that, I hadn't done any Buddhist study at all, and thank goodness the Vipassana meditation retreat was a 2-hour train ride from Sydney, and that was my first retreat. And I did get some teaching about the Four Noble Truths, and I did make a commitment to meditate every single day, which I kept since that day. Unless I've been sick or tired from traveling, I did meditate every day since Goenkaji's recommended that if we want the good results from meditation, we do have to apply a consistent and even effort towards cultivating it. maintaining mindfulness. Mindfulness is a quality that gets stronger over time if we keep up with skillful practices. And if we take a few steps and then we have a rest, it's like taking a step forward, taking a step back. It doesn't really get stronger. So we have to be consistent, and then we have to actually gently but consistently increase the skillful practices that we do so the mindfulness continues to get stronger. And mindfulness leads to the deathless, meaning insight into ultimate truth. I found myself on the island in Thailand, where at that meditation retreat taught by Stephen Rosemary Weisman, they were teaching reflective meditations, metta meditation and death meditation, mindfulness of sitting and walking. And that's where I learned that Buddhist practice was a whole range of practices and something that could be practiced in every posture. So that was a very important thing to learn. And then I realized that, see, I never had a feeling like I really want to be a monk. I was aware that there's a lot of rules and that it's not an easy life. So I never had this feeling of, I really want to be a monk. I really want to be a monk. But what I did have was, I can't see anything else that I could truly give myself to. And I was quite, I have a, like I said last week, what in Australia we would call a bullshit detector. I had this unwillingness to compromise in a way. So I just couldn't bring myself to work for a corporation or the government. I just couldn't do it. And so then I thought, okay, well, I'll try to be an actor or a singer. And, you know, you have this fantasy that as if actors and singers are allowed to make their own choices. It's, they're kind of often some of the most enslaved beings on the planet. They're kind of what their agents and stylists and managers force them to do. It's not really about expressing your creativity, except for the occasional lucky one, maybe. So I couldn't really see anything else that I could give myself to. And I did love meditation, and I did respect the Buddha. I had a great deal of faith in Lord Buddha, and really enjoyed meditation. And so when I found out about Wat Nanachat, a German man told me about it on the tropical island, and then I had that feeling of, I just have to go and explore this. It's just coming from a feeling of, I don't really have a choice in this matter. So I went to explore it, and I met Ajahn Jayasaro. And as I explained last week, I ended up spending a 7-week period at Wat Nanachat. And it was coincided, the last 4 weeks coincided with the first month of the rainy season retreat. Ajahn Jayasaro gave inspiring Dhamma talks night after night for that month. And something in me really died at that time. I explained last week that the me who could have became the massage therapist who worked volunteer work at the hospice in Sydney, he was a nice guy, but he died. He died, and the guy that was born was the guy that became Samanera Achalo, because when Ajahn Jayasaro articulated that the bhikkhu training was something that came out of the Buddha's enlightened mind, Lord Buddha having the capacity to, incredible being, he could have established any kind of order, and what he established was the bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, samanera, samaneri orders, and the lay 8 precept, 5 precept training. So when Ajahn Jayasaro explained that this lifestyle that we're practicing at Wat Nanachat came from an enlightened Buddha's mind, and then the Buddha spent millions of lives in perfecting wisdom, you basically have to accept that there's a reason for absolutely everything that Lord Buddha requires the monks to do and not do. And I have to accept that as someone who has faith in the Buddha. when Lord Buddha himself established that training, and then he lived within that training. And I just kind of had to accept, yeah, okay, this is actually the best thing I can do with my human life at this point in time. The other thing I'd noticed was that there were all these other people coming that really wanted to be monks. So I was, like I said, I'm not like, oh, I want to be a monk, I want to be a monk. No. I'm like, this is going to be really hard. This is really hard already. And so, but I did have faith. And as I said, I was experiencing, so I became a novice. And the first, and 5 days out of every 7, I wanted to disrobe for that year. And then 2 days out of 7, I was experiencing more peace than I would have experienced back in my life in Sydney. And I was very mindful that if I went back to my life in Sydney, I wouldn't have that superior quality of contentment and peacefulness, and that helped me to patiently endure. So it wasn't a match made in heaven, as it were. It wasn't an easy fit. Brett, who came from Sydney from the vegan cafe, and his beautiful people friends, the yoga people, the shiatsu people, the aromatherapy people, they're going to the beach, they're going to the movies, the new clothes, the fabulous food, all of that. And as I said, we used to greet each other with hugs. It was very touchy-feely. And then I went to live at Wat Nanachat, and I didn't really like the monks because they were, in a way, very critical. They're very fault-finding. And you'd kind of expect it because, in a way, it's the noticing the drawbacks of samsara, of the conditions, that gets people searching for something better. So for people to have come, in those days there was no internet, so to have made it to Thailand, to Northeast Thailand, 25 years ago, people had to be searching for something better. But what we all brought with us was that fault-finding tendency, and tendency towards being critical and judgmental. And so when you get a whole community of people with that tendency living together in a situation where high standards are required in absolutely every area, then you have a chafing kind of an environment. So I made it there. I lasted about 18 months. And then I met Ajahn Sumedho. And Ajahn Sumedho, at that time, he came to visit Thailand and to teach a retreat. And at that stage, Ajahn Sumedho was maybe he'd been a bhikkhu for 30 years. I'm thinking around 30 years. And so to me, he seemed very friendly, very happy. And his Dharma talks were very reflective and also quite entertaining. And so he was, to me, this sense of seeing some of the results of practice if you stick to it. And it was very attractive. So I was fortunate that some friends from South Africa, had said to me that if I needed any help at any point, they'd be willing to help me. So I did make a good friend, Ajahn Punyo, who was Tan Punyo at that time. Tan Punyo had spent some time training in the monasteries in England. And so he'd noticed that my character was a bit more sensitive, perhaps a bit more delicate than some of the other bhikkhus coming and training at Wat Nanachat. And he had said that he felt that maybe England would be a better fit for me. And so I was interested to go and try. So I did I did go to England to live with Ajahn Sumedho as a novice. And it was enormously helpful. I had very good karma with regards to the timing of that, because Ajahn Sumedho was going through a phase of what he called conviviality. He was emphasizing conviviality in the community, so friendliness. And he was in a phase of his practice where he was willing to have people come over and chat with him. And he was being very convivial. And so at that time, Luang Por Sumedho would have been about 62. And I was maybe 24. and I had massage skills, so that I'd learnt in Chiang Mai. So I would go over and massage his feet, and we would talk about many things. And Ajahn, in that particular phase of Ajahn Sumedho's practice and development, he was willing to talk about anything. And so he allowed me to share a lot of my inner world and a lot of my past. And we even were able to go for walks in the English countryside. I'd often go for a walk with Ajahn Sumedho around the fields of Amaravati Monastery. And it was a very grandfatherly like relationship. And he mirrored back to me, because I was having a lot of doubts about whether or not I could make it in the life. Yet I had this very strong faith in the Buddha and the practice. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. But I had a lot of self-doubts, because we all tend to get fixed perceptions about what we think is good. And then we all tend to have this tendency to compare ourselves to others. So according to my idea of what a monk should be, and some of the other good monks who I'd met, when I compared myself to it, I kind of felt like, that's not me. I'm not like that. And Ajahn Sumedho's tremendous gift to me was to point out what he thought were my strengths. And so what he thought my strengths were was the sensitivity and the capacity to reflect on my experience, even though I was chafing, and even though I was experiencing great difficulties and a lot of doubts, I was sensitive to that, and I was reflecting on it. And he said, this sensitivity and reflective ability that you have, if you just stick to it, these will be tremendous strengths in your practice. And he also described, at that time I was a novice and I hadn't made the decision to take the full bhikkhu training, which means a lot more rules, 227 rules. And he was saying, don't consider the bhikkhu training as all these things you have to do and all these things you shouldn't do. You should try to see it as Lord Buddha as giving you tools that you now have permission to use to work towards your enlightenment. Like, see it as a gift, see it as an opportunity. And so just that reframing for me how I could relate to the Vinaya, 227 rules, and affirming that he saw some good spiritual qualities that he felt would become strengths. And he was very humble. I'd tell him about my defilements and my kilesas and the things I was struggling with, and he was saying, Achalo, compared to me when I was your age, you're a saint, he would say. So he was, I don't know if that's true. Well, maybe, because he didn't become a bhikkhu until he was older than I was at that time. So when I was sitting there feeling like I was a terrible mess and I'd never be a good monk, Ajahn Sumedho was in university or in the Peace Corps and probably not keeping the precepts perfectly strictly. So when he was saying, compared to what I was doing when I was your age, you're doing pretty well, actually. So that was enormously helpful, being blessed by this leader of a community, this grandfatherly figure. Another thing was occurring for me when I was in England, is that I really didn't like England. So having grown up on the beach, more or less, in Australia, I didn't appreciate the grey, cold, damp weather. And I didn't appreciate sarcasm and backhanded compliments. And I missed delicious food. But more than that, whereas I'd felt I'd been struggling in the life at Wat Nana Chat, I had this awareness that spending time alone by myself in the forest each day was working. So the thing about doubts, if we can see a doubt as a doubt, it's obviously enormously helpful. It's not necessarily the truth. So you might have doubts about things. Doubts is one of the hindrances. So I was doubting that it was working. But when it comes to spiritual practice, we have to have patience. It takes time. The various factors of spiritual training take time to work on us, the practitioner. And so when I was at Wat Nanachat, doubting the place, doubting my abilities, doubting that there was progress, when I went to a situation where I had to live in more of a dormitory-like situation and have a lot more contact with people, I realized that for myself, the quality of clarity around what I was experiencing was getting less. And in hindsight, I realized that spending time by myself each day in a small hut in a forest was something that was bringing a lot more clarity to the mind. And I really missed it. I really missed the arms round, the beautiful leaving the monastery gates in the gold of dawn, silent, this beautiful ancient archetypal practice, receiving alms, not talking to anybody, mindful of the footsteps, walking through the warm tropical air, the sound of the insects and the birds. These various parts of the training in Thailand that I realized were training me. But I had to remove myself from the situation to actually see. You see, I'd spent a year and a half there, and which for a 25-year-old is quite a bit of time. And it was when I was in the rolling hills of Hertfordshire, walking through the cold mist, that I realized that time in Wat Pah Nanachat had been developing clarity, and I actually did enjoy parts of it. But going to England and meeting Ajahn Sumedho and having the chance to his approach to practice of not judging, allowing the mind states to simply be as they are, and placing the attention on the awareness, but really not judging mind states, simply aware and coming back to the awareness, and that non-identifying with mind states and giving the mind a lot more space, not trying to suppress thoughts or force the mind into a peaceful state, but just going to that awareness, the awareness. So I had the good fortune to sit a 10-day retreat with him at Amaravati Monastery, and the conversations after the meal and the foot massages and walks in the countryside. And so I benefited a great deal from his learning, from the way he reflected on experience and his lack of judgmentalness, having done it for 30 years. And I say, wow, you become this, that he became this spacious, magnanimous, kind, reflective monk with a great sense of humor that wasn't judging everything. And that he affirmed that he felt I had some good qualities and that I should stick to it. And so I decided after 4 months that I wanted to go back to Thailand. And so I went back and I took the Bhikkhu training. But to this day, I do consider Ajahn Sumedho as one of my teachers, and I am indeed grateful to him. The next time he came to Thailand, Ajahn Jayasaro was very kind. He allowed me to attend another of Ajahn Sumedho's retreats in Chiang Mai. Did a 10-day retreat, was able to reconnect with one of my Ajahns. And later in America, when I was staying at Abhayagiri for my 4th and 5th Pansa, I also did another retreat with Ajahn Sumedho when he did the teacher's retreat at Spirit Rock. So I was able to keep checking in with the way he approaches practice and training, and being blessed by his benevolent, developed sense of presence, spiritual qualities. And I actually get a bit embarrassed. I'm going to admit to my being embarrassed here, because despite the fact that I had many wonderful teachers and had met many wonderful methods, I had a very tenacious and persistent habit of doubting myself and doubting that I could do it. So by this stage, I've already done the Goenka retreat. I've already attended Rosemary Weissman's reflective retreats 5 times, done 2 Mahasi Sayadaw retreats. I've listened to Ajahn Jayasaro's Dhamma talks. I've lived with him for a year. I've studied with Ajahn Sumedho. I've spent some time with Ajahn Pasanno, and his sense of presence and groundedness and solidity and decency, and all of these people have mirrored back to me that they felt I had, enough spiritual qualities to keep training. But I still had this, let's just say I was rich with suffering. I had a special ability in the area of suffering. I was talking about this last week. I think it's probably related to a recent heavenly rebirth combined with the monastic birth before that. So wisdom barami is going to manifest as noticing dukkha, noticing suffering. So people who don't have much wisdom, they're not going to notice it. They're going to be in denial about it. They're going to blame other people for it. They're going to make all sorts of excuses about it, but they're not going to notice it as a characteristic and try to take responsibility for it. But if you have wisdom barami, you can't not notice it. Oh, this is suffering. Oh, this is suffering. Oh, that's suffering. Everywhere I look is suffering. And also, you have to begin to admit that a large part of the problem is you, what you're doing. And that's a different kind of suffering. So then if you've had a recent heavenly rebirth, when you come back to the human form world, you're probably going to have a heightened level of sensitivity. You're not going to be as thick-skinned as all of these other guys that were soldiers in their past life, and all of the people that have recently come up from the animal or ghost realms. You're going to be a little bit more reflective and sensitive than those people. So there I was, already been doing this training, monastic training, for 2.5 years. So that's the end of my first rainy season retreat. And I heard that the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok was a place where you could go and make aspirational vows or ask for help. And so as a Western monk, I was always a little bit of the faith proclivity, probably what you call a faith type. So when somebody says you can go and make a vow or a prayer at the Emerald Buddha and the devas or the merit of the Buddha will help you, I'm like, okay, cool, great, let's do that. But a lot of other Westerners would be, what do you go and pray to a stone statue? How's that going to help anything? One second, I have to plug in a power pack to the tablet. Okay, where were we? We were at the Emerald Buddha. So, are you still interested?
Yes, Ajahn.
Okay, shall I continue? I don't want to bore you.
You can go ahead, Ajahn.
I always like to ask people if they're interested when we get to the most interesting part, you see. I'm teasing you.
It always happens, Ajahn.
Yes. So my twin brother had come to visit me, and I had decided, I was very fortunate in that Ajahn Jayasaro had allowed me to go into a jungle area 1 month earlier. And so that synchronized with my twin brother being in Bangkok. And So I decided I'm going to go to the Emerald Buddha. So I went to the Emerald Buddha, and as you remember from even as a layman in Sydney, I was like looking to the sky and asking for guidance. And I had been praying for the forces of light to lead me on the path of love, light, and truth. So there was faith in benevolent forces in the universe already. So it just made sense to me that an ancient Buddha statue in the middle of a Buddhist kingdom would probably have some potent Buddhist forces attached to it or working with it. So I went there, and it was very beautiful. And so my aspirational prayer was, I admit that I had good teachers, and I didn't feel that I wasn't fortunate. Part of my suffering, part of my theme of suffering was that given how lucky I was, that I could still have so many doubts and still feel so miserable. This was like, I felt like I should have been more peaceful. I should have been more consistent. If you ask me, was I grateful? Yeah, I was grateful. If you ask me, did I think I was fortunate? I was very mindful that I was one of the most fortunate beings on the planet. And yet, I still suffered a lot. And this is where I needed help, because I didn't know if I could put up with the suffering. And so I acknowledge and respect the development of my teachers, and I was grateful for everything they taught me. But I basically was mindful of the fact that I needed some heavy duty help because I was rich with suffering. So that was my aspiration to the Emerald Buddha. I paid respect to the Emerald Buddha. I said, I have faith in the Buddha. I have faith in this bhikkhu training. I'm interested to be a bhikkhu for the remainder of my life. Now, this is an important part of aspirational prayers. You have to state your commitment and willingness to cultivate goodness, to do something good. That's what's going to get the attention of the benevolent forces of the universe. So basically I'm saying, hey guys, I am willing to do this. However, I need help. So the vow I made was, if there are any especially gifted masters in Thailand that I have a karmic connection with who could help me, may I meet with such a being so that I can continue. And so it was a very interesting few days in Bangkok, because the next day I went to see some autopsies at the police hospital, with the understanding that as a young man who had doubts and some lust, 24, 25 at the time, maybe 26 by then, and you go and contemplate the nature of bodies, it tends to cool things down. So it's one of the things that's possible in Thailand, because there is a large Buddhist population, and it's understood as a part of Buddhist practice that you can get permission to go and see some autopsies in the morgue. And when you go to the morgue, you also tend to see the person who had the brain hemorrhage, and the person who had the motorcycle accident, and the person that drowned. You see all sorts of dead people, dead bodies. And that's helpful for your mindfulness of death meditation. And you can bring that memory back to mind to deepen your awareness of death and impermanence. So that's something, I think I've done that maybe 10 times in the first 15 years. So I've seen a lot of dead bodies. And then I went into the jungle, and a very interesting thing happened. I was there with Ajahn Sudanto, Ajahn Chandako, Ajahn Kalyano, and myself. That's 4 of us. Ajahn Kalyano was Ajahn Anan's senior Western disciple. And so we'd gone in for 1 month. This area is the area where the monks from Wat Nanachak go every hot season for 2 or 3 months. So I went in a month earlier. And then Ajahn Kalyano said that there's a possibility that Ajahn Anan might come. And so Ajahn Anan did come with a group of 5 monks. And I'd heard from Ajahn Punyo that Ajahn Anan was reputed to be enlightened and reputed to have psychic powers. So that was exciting. So Ajahn Anan came, and he in those days, he was younger than I am now. I think he would have been about 43. And so he was still capable of climbing the mountain and staying in a tent in the jungle. And so he did that for the first, I think it was the first 3 nights. And he said that he would talk to the Westerners after that. So he went up into the jungle with his Thai monks. And when he talked with us, I was, that was the time where I really felt his metta, like not just manifesting as kindness, but as an energy that radiated from him that both cooled the quality of suffering in my mind and enhanced a quality of happiness in my mind. And that, as you could understand or appreciate, that's very helpful when you're experiencing a lot of suffering. Now, the particular question I asked Ajahn Anan, and to this day I'm so grateful to his response, was when I said to him, I feel such weariness. I'd really rather kill myself, but I do believe in karma and rebirth. So I know that that's not the way out. But I experience such a heavy state of weariness, and I just want it to end. And I'm worried about myself. I don't really know what to do with this experience. So, and there's fear. You know, another teacher might have said, well, maybe you need to go and see a psychiatrist. Maybe you need to be on medication. If you're having suicidal thoughts, maybe this life isn't right for you. It's too hard for you. Maybe you should leave. There could have been any number of negative responses to that experience. When Ajahn Anan looked at me, and Ajahn Anan said, when I was a junior monk, I used to feel exactly how you feel now, Achalo. So no judgment, total acceptance. And this great master in front of me is telling me, not that long ago I felt just like you. So it's a suggestion of incredible possibility for growth. And then he said, in the process of developing meditation, it's not uncommon for sensitivity to develop before the equanimity. So your experience is as though you're sitting in the middle of a burning house. The house is on fire and you're burning. And he said, that's actually a correct perception. The house is on fire. It is burning and you are in the middle of it. So again, he's mirroring back to me that actually there's something good in this experience. Then he said, the only way that the mindfulness will get stronger and that you will develop equanimity is through patiently enduring with this feeling that you can't take it anymore. He said, what will happen is that is what will make the mindfulness stronger. And at a certain point, you will be able to separate out the knowing from that which is known. So the dukkha characteristic, the characteristic of suffering, at that time, I was suffering. Strong sense of self, still young in the practice. But with time, I will be able to separate from that experience and know suffering. He said the mind will find a place to rest where it can know the characteristic of suffering, but not actually be suffering. And he said the only way that that capacity develops is through patiently enduring. So basically he's saying, don't even think of giving up. And basically there's nothing else you can do other than bear with it. But just that much was so enormously helpful. The lack of judgment, the vote of confidence, the confirmation, what your experience is accurate and correct. Where you are in the process is where you are in the process. And it's a good process and it's going in a good direction. And if you just stick with it, there will be a lot of development. Coming from somebody who'd moved through that and who had found a place beyond suffering. And so then I asked him, well, Tanajan, do you think I'm trainable? And he looked at me and he said, you have merit, Achalo. And that was very helpful, because I wasn't sitting there, I wasn't feeling like this is so weary and I've got so much suffering and I just wish I could die. I wasn't sitting there thinking, I have merit. I was like, I'm a mess. And Ajahn Anan said, you have merit, young man. So then I asked him, well, am I trainable? He's like, yeah, sure, just keep going. And then I said, well, can I come and practice with you? And he said, I invite you to come and practice with me. So I did go and spend my next rainy season retreat with Ajahn Anan. And there was another wonderful, so what I'm kind of, Ajahn Anan sometimes describes young monks as being new drivers. They kind of rush forward too fast and then you have to slam on the brakes, or you take a corner too fast, or it's kind of like, and he explains older monks as like they know how to drive, they can kind of do cruise control, they know how to pace things. But so then when I was inspired again, when I went to his monastery, I was putting a lot of effort into practice, because Ajahn Anan said I can do it, Ajahn Anan said I can have merit, but I was wanting to be enlightened like by the end of the week, if you know what I mean. So I was putting a lot of effort into my practice and I was getting some good results. And but what would happen would be like I would have a peak experience of like the most peacefulness I'd ever, or maybe I'd see something interesting in my meditation, and then the next day I would have terrible grumpiness and irritability, or maybe fall into some kind of depression. And it would be really kind of traumatic, because you've just glimpsed something better. You're experiencing some radiance, some spaciousness, some sense of distance from it, some coolness, and there's that sense of getting somewhere. And then the next day, the misery's there again, and the irritability is there again, and it's hard again. And so they had this chore time at Wat Mapchan that used to kind of drive me crazy, where you had to sweep, or I've talked about it before, you had to sweep leaves in certain areas so that there's literally no leaf left. And we were doing it together as a group. This big monastery, and all of the monks had to come together and clean the hall together and sweep the leaves together. I didn't understand what they were saying. And it just used to drive me crazy, because if you were going to sweep the leaves so that there were just a few left, it would take 2/3 of the time. But if you have to sweep the leaves so that there's not a single leaf left, it takes a long time. And then what do you think's happening? As soon as you finish, a few more leaves are falling. So it's like, to a Westerner, it makes no sense. Since as soon as you finish sweeping, the leaves are going to keep falling anyway, why can't we just sweep it so that they're almost all swept and just finish more quickly, and so that we can all have a cup of tea and I can go back to my kuti and have some time by myself? No, have to sweep as a group, have to sweep until there's no leaves left. So I would get kind of hot and irritated about the fact that this didn't make much sense. And so I was so irritated one day, I didn't want to wait for the tea. And we had to have, then we had to wait. There was one other group of monks that would clean Ajahn Anand's kuti, and then they would come down, and we weren't allowed to drink our cup of tea until those monks came. So sitting there just waiting, and I'm like, for me, it's like, oh, it's a waste of time. I want to get back to my meditation. I want to get back to my walking meditation path. No, I have to wait to have my cup of tea, and all of the tea and the juice, it's all there, but no, you can't have it. You have to wait. So I had so much irritation and frustration that I actually lifted up. Monks have a kind of an undershirt. I lifted up my undershirt over my face and exposed my belly, and I was sitting in front of the Buddha statue in the middle of the Dhamma hall with my belly exposed and my shirt over my head, because I felt like I needed to be able to be as miserable as I was, but I didn't want anybody to see my grimacing, miserable face. So I just put my shirt over my head so that I could allow myself to feel as miserable as I was and just sit there. The mind became a little bit peaceful. And then I thought, well, if you don't want to wait for the drink, don't wait for the drink. If you want to go back, just go back. Don't have a drink today. Okay. So I bowed and I left the Dhamma hall. And so I'm walking up the road, and lo and behold, Ajahn Anan is standing in the middle of the road. Just Ajahn Anan and me. And I fall on my knees and I say, Ajahn, when will it ever get any better? And keeping in mind that I wanted to be enlightened by the end of the week. And Ajahn Anan had said I had merit. Ajahn Anan had said I was trainable. So I was going to do it. Big sense of self, fed up with suffering. Ajahn Anan said I can do it. I'm going to do it. He looks at me and he says, Achalo, in 5 years, it will be a little bit better. And I'm like, oh, what? And then he says, in 10 years, it'll be even better. I'm like, oh. Then he says to me, Achalo, you need to do loving kindness meditation for the first 10 minutes of every single meditation. For obvious reasons now in hindsight, there's impatience, there's irritability, there's frustration, and there's some self-aversion, a lot of rejecting of my abilities, rejecting of my experience, judgment. You need to do 10 minutes of loving kindness meditation at the beginning of every session. And then he said, and you need to contemplate not self. Hundreds of times, thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times. Now that was a very painful teaching, and it was a perfect teaching, because it's not from the space of a self that is fed up and a self that wants to be liberated. That's not the space where liberation occurs. It's laying the conditions that need to be laid consistently and with a humble sense of self that begins to have insights into not self. And this process doesn't occur according to one's time frame or one's agenda. One has to lay the causes and then the fruits come in their own time. And the metta practice and the contemplations of not self support that process. But as you can imagine, on a different level, it's very inspiring. I'm really struggling and I really need some help in that moment, and I wander off in a bit of a huff. And there's the master in the middle of the road waiting to answer my question. So to this day, that those two conversations, I've had many, many wonderful conversations with my teacher, my main teacher in Thailand, but those two occasions really stand out to me as times where I learned a lot about the process and committed more deeply to the process, and received obviously my teacher's blessing to keep deepening the process, but I'm very grateful. There were other experiences. One of those days where I was sweeping the leaves, feeling hot, judging it, not liking it because it didn't make sense. All of a sudden, the irritation, the anger, the frustration was just gone in 1 second. And there was a feeling of joy, lightness, and ease. And then I looked to my left and I saw Ajahn Anan kind of walking past. Oh, now that's interesting. The next day, I went up and asked him, did you do something, Tanajan, when I was sweeping leaves? And he's like, yeah, I saw that the prafarang was hot. Prafarang kamlang ron, he said. And then he did this, I spread metta to you. And he lifted up his hand and he lifted up this other hand and he did this movement. He said, I knocked your mind state out of your mind with loving kindness. And I'm like, could you please do that every day? And he said, no, He said, but I wanted you to see that it's not necessary for you to feel that way. It is possible for you to be experiencing well-being. And I wanted you to see how pleasant loving kindness can be. So remember how I told you, do 10 minutes of metta meditation at the beginning of every sitting? That's where this leads, Achalo. So be diligent in your metta practice. And so that also stands out, obviously, as a wonderful teaching of the master showing you the potential of your mind to inspire you to put forth the work in cultivating that potential. So I'm very grateful to Tanajan. So that was my second rainy season retreat, and I mentioned last week, I went to live with Ajahn Pasanno in my fourth and fifth retreats in California. And then I love Ajahn Pasanno. I benefited from that time, and I really missed Ajahn Anan. And so I actually went back and spent my 6th, 7th, 9th, and 10th rainy season retreats with Ajahn Anan. And his first trip to Australia, he invited me to come along. And his first trip to China, one of the holy mountains, he invited me to come along. And I became quite close to Tanajan. And to this day, I spoke to him on the phone today, for example. So to this day, I can call up my Ajahn. Thank goodness he's willing to use a mobile phone so that he can keep in touch with his disciples. And so I still keep in touch with and have a close relationship with my teacher, Ajahn Anan. But the other things you learn from Ajahn Anan, the reason I believe he's enlightened. So this is a personal, even amongst the forest monks, there'll be those of us who believe that some are enlightened and that others maybe aren't. It's a matter of personal faith. You can't not have doubts. You cannot believe your doubts. So you don't believe them completely. But who you have faith in is an important consideration. And it's different for different people. So some of the people who other people think are enlightened, I might not always agree. And some of the teachers, well, I don't have that faith. And some of the teachers who I do have faith in are enlightened, other monks have doubts in. So that's just the way it is. But the reason I have faith in Ajahn Anan is that he can explain the practices that he was doing and the qualities that fell away from his mind after doing those practices. And then he can also explain that negative qualities that fell away from the mind on those significant occasions never returned. And, you know, I also, fortunately, I had these massaging abilities, and I was able to massage my teacher's feet and his back sometimes and ask him all sorts of questions about, I like to ask about the heaven realms and the devas and these kind of things. And it was very interesting. There would be the times that he would talk about them and the times that he wouldn't talk about them. So if he's kind of upright in his office, doing business, talking with the monks, if you asked a question about devas, past lives, other realms, he'd just kind of look at you kind of like, present moment, just like, you know, very Zen-like. But if you were massaging him late at night and you could feel when he went into metta jhana, you're touching his body, and he's going into metta jhana, you can feel that. And then he comes out of metta jhana and he opens his eyes and there's this light streaming out of his eyes. It's like, and I just knew, I don't know, so has a brain, a little bit clever. I just knew, now's the time to ask the question. Because coming out of metta jhana, he's in this magnanimous, spacious, loving, Ajahn, could you tell me about such and such a deva or such and such a realm or such and such a past life? And 9 times out of 10, if you got him in that moment, you would get some very interesting answers. So glimpsing the abilities of a monk with a purified mind and a lot of concentration to be able to perceive beings in other realms and to be able to recollect information from past lives of himself and others. Very wonderful thing to have, to be privy to, and to have had that opportunity on scores and scores, hundreds of times. So that was when I'd made my vow at the Emerald Buddha, I'm rich with suffering. I'm going to need a superhero kind of a monk to keep my faith up and to keep me practicing. In Ajahn, I believe I met him, and that synchronicity and that timing was very, very helpful. As Ajahn became not as healthy as he got older, and as he developed more and more, he got more and more disciples. Some of the later generation haven't been able to have that kind of closeness. So I was very lucky. And when I visit Wat Mapjan, a lot of the Western monks will come and they want to chat with Uncle Achalo, because Ajahn Achalo will tell them all the interesting psychic powers stories from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And I'm like, like I'm talking at 9 o'clock at night. I'm like, they're sitting on the floor for 2 or 3 hours. And you guys want to go back yet? Are you going? And they stay there. They want more stories. I'm going to tell the fun stories. So unfortunately, I can't tell you stories. It's Ajahn will get upset with me. I can tell the other monks the good stories, but I can't tell many of the stories. I can tell those kind of obvious ones where I was really suffering. I made a vow, may a teacher please come and help me, and Ajahn manifested in the forest. I remember kind of thinking I still kind of needed some confirmation. Is this my teacher? Is this my teacher? There were 9 monks. There were 8 pieces of pizza. And he sent his piece of pizza to me in his bowl lid, because I didn't get the piece of pizza, you see. And then it's like, that's the sign. Ajahn Anand's my teacher. He gave me his piece of pizza. And then suffering in the middle of the hall and feeling like I can't do this anymore and wandering out in a huff. And there he is in the middle of the road, appears to be waiting. That kind of knocking the painful mind state out of my mind, showing me that it is possible to be in the posture of sweeping leaves and not be in a kind of a silent rage. And these things are really, really helpful. In terms of other teachers, I guess my other main teacher would be the Dalai Lama. Well, it is the Dalai Lama. So when I was sitting on the stage in a San Francisco area during the time when I was living in California, he was teaching the Heart Sutra, His Holiness was, and I was about 7 or 8 meters from him. And he was talking about consciousness, and he said a phrase which really struck me as extraordinary. He said, there is no limit to which consciousness can be developed. And then he just looked at me straight in the eyes. And that phrase just struck me. Like as people who aspire for liberation, not necessarily interested in cultivating consciousness infinitely, but when the Dalai Lama said that phrase and looked me in the eyes, I just had that sense of, here is someone who has cultivated consciousness infinitely, looking me in the eyes and saying, this is what is possible. This is what you can do with conditions. If a person wants to work with the conditions to cultivate a really extraordinary potential and ability, such as all great bodhisattvas do in the process of becoming a Buddha, it just really struck me. There is no limit. And then when they talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas as being immeasurables, there's no limit to how much you want to cultivate loving kindness, for example. If you develop your metta jhana, you can develop it to embrace the whole world, this earth. Then you can develop it to embrace the solar system. Then you can develop it to embrace this universe. Then you can develop it to embrace several universes. It really then comes down to how many millions of lives a person wants to invest in mental cultivation. And so just that phrase from the Dalai Lama and him looking in my eyes, and I just got it. Here is a being that has spent millions of lives cultivating their consciousness. And as that was just, for me, that was just like, whoa, wow. And then the next day, he was giving the Medicine Buddha empowerment, and by some extreme karmic synchronicity, good fortune, they allowed us to come in and meditate in our reserved seats. And my reserved seat was 2 meters from the Dalai Lama while he was doing his preparations for the Medicine Buddha empowerment. And then just feeling in my own meditative state, his meditative state, this waves of powerful bliss and rapture and blessings just kind of blasting out of his mind, and blasting through my mind. And so what the Dalai Lama as a teacher showed me is just in terms of mental cultivation and in a way the superiority of the barami to the kilesa. It's like that samadhi, metta, compassion, mudita, altruism can be developed infinitely, and thoughts of selfishness, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of greed, thoughts that can be completely eradicated. And that a being, if they chose to, could come back again and again and again and again and keep cultivating for the sake, with only the intention to help other beings. So in a way, the Dalai Lama is just like, I felt like he showed me what is possible on the path of mental cultivation, and how inspiring that is, that at least some beings choose to do that. And it then just comes down to how much is one willing to work with the painful conditions of samsara for the sake of benefiting others, or how quickly one wants out of samsara and allows the mind to absorb into the nibbana dhatu. So even Luang Por Mun, in the Thai forest tradition, in his biography, it states that it was 500 lives since the time that he could have been an arahant that he chose to cultivate further with the intention of being a Buddha. But after those 500 lives, he assessed the situation and he made a different decision. Basically, he was going to cash in the barami that had been cultivated and help as many beings as possible in that life, but he was aiming for arahantship. And so the result of that was Luang Por Mun did attain arahantship within one life, because the spiritual faculties were so well developed. And because of those extra 500 lives, then he had all these amazing abilities at teaching people, using his psychic powers, giving teachings which were appropriate. And I believe that Luang Por Mun had 12 arahant disciples. And then this can't really be separated. People like to separate Theravada and Mahayana, Vajrayana. And it's like, look, here is a being that was building virtue for the sake of being a Buddha. Because he became an arahant, he regenerated the Thai forest tradition for generations and made it possible for all these other people to work towards their enlightenment. And so you do have people building virtues in every tradition, and it's a personal choice how much a person intends to benefit others along the way. And it's That's just something individual practitioners have to explore for themselves, what their aspiration is. And as far as I'm concerned, they're all noble, they're all beautiful, and you should just commit to the one that gives rise to the most sense of faith and conviction that you can give rise to. So that is the end of part 2 of my explanation of or description of my teachers and the biggest lessons that I learned from them and my gratitude towards them. And a large part of what I try to share with yourselves and other people is I try to share what they have taught me. But the reason I do that is I do see that I have much less suffering than I used to have 25 years ago. And it is because people did put forth the effort to teach me and give me the information and encourage. So we do depend upon getting the information, being encouraged, having our potential affirmed. And so in my own small way, I'm trying to do that for you to some degree. And I was touched by your gratitude for my life thus far, and made me recollect all of the things I'm grateful for as well. And so I offer this for your reflection. I hope that something I said was uplifting and helpful to you.
Handamayang Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu. Thank you very much, Ajahn.
You're welcome. I'm not going to say people's names because otherwise other people might feel left out, but I just want to look at your beautiful faces. Lord Buddha talks about the Kalyana Chon, the Kalyana Jana, the lovely beings. So all of you who are making efforts to train your minds, you have the Patujana, which is translated as thickies, people with thick kilesas. And then you have the Kalyana Jana, those lovely beings who are making efforts to train themselves. And then you have the Arya Jana, the noble beings. So you're all lovely beings. Some of you might even be noble beings. And happy to spend this time with you. And I wish you well wherever you are.
Okay. I'll let you go. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for logging in. See you next week, next Wednesday. Bye.
Choice.